Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this Gaming.com video we're going to be discussing and analysing Ryzen 7 2000 series processor results. Now these benchmarks are very interesting for several reasons. The first of which is the chip has been reported to be running up to 4.35 GHz, which is insane. No Ryzen processor is capable of running that currently at stock frequencies, and yet this chip appears to be doing it rather effortlessly, and most likely this is a functionality of XFR 2.0, which, if you remember, is not part of the specification of the original Ryzen 1000 series. That just used XFR 1.0. XFR 2, however, is part of the Ryzen APUs, which have just seen a release, and so it does appear that it's making quite the difference here. The second thing is we also see a plethora of different benchmarks, which is obviously very important. More benchmarks, even synthetic ones, does of course mean a better understanding of how the chip will stand up against the older generation of Ryzen's, plus of course Intel's own Coffee Lake, Kaby Lake, and so on and so on. And it's actually possible that we do see improvements on IPC, because it would appear that we definitely see lower latency on this chip, but we'll get to that in just a second. So it looks like this is a Ryzen 7 perhaps 2700, 2700X. And while some of the result information on SysOff Sandra is obfuscated, we can get a fair indication of what the chip is going to be. It has a core voltage rating of 1.250 volts. It is of course an 8-core 16-thread processor, and once again we can see a base clock of 3.7 GHz up to 4.35 GHz, which is very, 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 very important. As a slight reminder, this is a 12nm part. This is not an entirely new piece of silicon. This is not, let's say, Zen 2. Instead, it's a shrunk down, tweaked version of the current Summit Ridge architecture. But with that said, there are definitely some improvements here, and some of these are pretty damn obvious from the Ada64 memory benchmarks. Once again, the CPU type has been hidden away, so we can't see that, but we can see a comparison against an octo-core AMD Ryzen 7 1700X, so we can make the assumption that this is probably a 2700X, it's an AM4 socket. The clock speed that's being reported of Ada64 running here is essentially 4 GHz for both chips, but while the same motherboard has been employed on the two results, you'll notice that the latency is considerably lower on the Ryzen 2000 series chips. Now that, of course, is going to be very important, particularly in cache. When you have lower latency, it should slightly improve IPC across the chip, and especially for multi-threading. One thing that's not abundantly clear is whether 4.35 GHz is actually achievable with a 300 series motherboard. Now what that means is that while in theory the chip can run this, if you're doing, let's say, an entirely new build and you're putting in a 400 series motherboard, if you have an existing 300 series motherboard, it's unclear if XFR 2.0 is going to function or not. Now it's possible there might be a BIOS update that's required, it's possible that it might just work out of the gate, or it's possible that there is just some other factor in place. Maybe AMD just choose not to do that as a method to push you to upgrade the board, or maybe there's a hardware limitation, we just don't know yet. Most likely, however, given what information we're seeing here, it's a pre-production sample. So it's not, exactly a retail sample, but it's pretty close right now to the final design. It's not like an early engineering prototype or something like that. Okay, enough of that. What about the actual results? So we'll start out with our friend, our buddy, 3D Mark. Now here they are showing, with Hardware Battle being the source of this, although interestingly their results have now been taken down officially from the website, but of course various people have managed to grab them. Now what you could see is a plethora of different processors which are being compared with future processor, the Ryzen 7 2000. And we see it compared against the previous generation, and also a variety of different Intel processors. Now, immediately, one thing that I'll spot and I'm going to stick here with Firestrike, not Ultra, just for a second, is that if we compare the future processor versus the 1700X, you're looking at about a 2,000 point difference, which is fairly profound. It's about 1,000 points higher than the 1800X, and yes, I'm going to be rounding things up here because otherwise it's just going to be way too complex. This also means that previously the 1800X and the 8700K were roughly neck and neck, with the 8700K having a marginal lead, but now the future processor does indeed benefit about 1,200 points over the 8700K. Now obviously switching things to the Ultra slightly changes the story, but overall the results are very similar in terms of the future processor having an advantage. Now once again, these are physics scores, so these are not pegged to graphics necessarily. So what about other results, right? Because, well, we do have them, including the Maxon Cinebench R15. Now, I find these results really cool because we have a single core and multi-core set of results. And we'll start out things first with the multi-core. So the 1800X and the 1700X have always scored fairly well here. We'll stick with the 1700X, which scores just under 1500. The future processor scores just under 1800. So we're looking at around 300 points difference. Or to put it into some level of context, about 140 points higher than the 1800X. This also means that it's far and away faster than the 8700K. So for folks who don't have the cash to buy, let's say, a Threadripper, especially in 1950, yes, you're still going to be considerably slower, but it's not going to be so much slower anymore. It's, you know, at least it's some level of improvement. So if you're doing some level of 3D rendering, then these chips are definitely going to be some advantage, and obviously a lot of this is going to be down to clock speed. Single core, however, Intel did have the advantage, and they still do, without any question. It's just not quite as pronounced, so profound. So we'll start once again with the 1700X, which has a single core score of 153, or the 1800X, which has 157 to its name. The future processor, meanwhile, has 178. Now let's compare that against some different Intel processors. So what this means is single thread performance here is slightly better, and by slightly I mean 1 point better than the 6700. Sorry, than the 7600K, It also means there's not quite the gulf anymore between the Coffee Lake CPUs and the Ryzen CPUs when it comes to single thread performance, which does mean, at least in theory, when we start to transition more to gaming benchmarks, which unfortunately we don't really have any gaming benchmarks here, we do have a lot of synthetics, at least we kind of get an indication that frame rates should be up. Okay, so now we have Sysov Sandra, and these are single thread performance tests, which is quite nice actually. Once again, I'm very interested in the single thread, and all of these tests were conducted 3 times and they've averaged the results, which is absolutely awesome. So the future processor, we'll start things out there, scores 16.91. So that's considerably faster than the 15.13 of the 1700X. That's actually rather impressive indeed. In fact, if we were to start comparing that against even the 7960X, we actually see that the future processor, at least in this particular result, does do better. And it's within the spitting distance of the 8600K. Now you're going to say, well, you know, there's still about a point difference there, and I would agree with you. But compare, let's say, 16.91 versus 18. Compare that to the almost 3-point deficit of the 1700X. That's quite a profound difference indeed. Finally, let's go with the Drystone Aggregated Int Native. Once again, let's start things out with the 1700X, 29.96, which definitely made the AMD side of things in these results quite weak. Even the 1950X only scores 31.71, which is actually slower even than the i5 7600K. Compare that to the future processor, and it is actually the fastest processor on these tests. We see 42, which is faster than the 8700K, which scores 41.76, and faster than the 7980XE, which scores 38.77. I don't want to do a full in-depth analysis here because, well, I think I've pretty much said all I can, but these results, at least to me, are very impressive indeed. If they're even slightly accurate to the final results that we see from the Ryzen 2000s, it's going to be very impressive, and I'm going to be very curious to see what happens with Threadripper. Don't forget, Threadripper will also see an updated lineup of processors later this year, which we could presume is going to be, let's say, the 2950X or whatever. And if we see an improvement in the latency on those processors, if we see an improvement in clock speed, then I do suspect that Intel might have a really good competitor in the HEDT market, perhaps even better than what they do now. But for the mainstream segment, I definitely think Intel have the single-thread advantage still. In most situations, they do. And I would be lying to you otherwise. But, and this is the key word, but AMD are going to make a very compelling case for themselves. I'm going to be curious to see what AMD managed to achieve in games over the next 12 months as developers become increasingly familiar with the Ryzen architecture. Of course, with Ryzen first release, there were some games that just did terribly. Rise of the Tomb Raider. I mean, there's a reason that I actually had to redo some tests on Rise of the Tomb Raider. In fact, I actually had to redo quite a lot of tests because Rise of the Tomb Raider received a patch, Ashes of the Singularity received a patch, and then of course there was BIOS revisions as well, which subsequently improved performance. Microsoft released patches to improve Ryzen performance, and so on and so on and so on. So over the past 12 months, we've definitely seen I guess you could see an upsurge in performance from Ryzen compared to if you were to benchmark it 12 months ago versus if you were to benchmark right now. Almost certainly a lot of games do a lot better. But now that those, I guess you could say, newbie gains from the patches and just developers becoming better acquainted with the architecture are somewhat fading away, what we have to rely on now from AMD is their actual own innovation and own tweaks to the architecture. And it looks like what we're seeing here is pretty much akin to what we'd imagined. It looks like 10% improvement, 10% clock speed improvement is definitely within the realms of acceptability, but with XFR we do see slightly more than that, and with lower latency and from what we're hearing as well, better memory controllers and a few other tweaks here and there on the silicon, I have a fairly good feeling for the new generation of Ryzens. It's certainly not going to put Coffee Lake out of business. It's certainly not going to make Intel run for the hills. But if AMD manage to be competitive with the pricing, which I suspect they will because it's AMD and that's pretty much their ball game, is to be as competitive on the CPU side of things as possible, with the, pricing as possible, then I think AMD should be in a fairly good position. The only thing that could possibly scupper AMD is if Intel do release an 8-core 16-thread Coffee Lake, and if they could do it at a good price, which I don't know. I am somewhat skeptical that they're going to be able to release it at a cheap enough price to really make AMD sweat. I think Intel can release an 8-core 16-thread Coffee Lake part, but is it going to be at a price point that AMD are really losing a lot of sales? Well, we just don't know. With all of that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.